The word democracy was born in Greece. For many, that alone is enough to paint an image of justice, freedom, and equality as the pillars of this civilization. From school lessons to political speeches, ancient Greece is often presented as the cradle of free thought and full citizenship. But does this image hold up under deeper analysis, or is it hiding one of the greatest paradoxes in human history? Athens, the city that symbolizes the peak of democracy, was also a deeply unequal society, where freedom was a luxury reserved for a few. For every citizen with a voice in the agora, there were many others silenced by the chains of slavery. At the height of its glory, the city is estimated to have had around 100,000 inhabitants, and more than half were enslaved or non-citizens. The much-praised Greek freedom was, in practice, a structure built upon the servitude of those who had no political existence whatsoever. The exclusivity of Athenian democracy was staggering. To be considered a citizen, a man had to be born of Athenian parents, be free, and go through a strict process of education. Women, foreigners, the poor and enslaved people were automatically excluded from this social contract. Democracy was, in truth, a disguised aristocracy, and worse yet, one sustained by an economy that depended directly on enslaved labor in homes, fields, mines, and public works. It's almost ironic that while Athenian citizens debated ethics, justice, and freedom on the stages of philosophy, hundreds of men, women, and children worked in the shadows, without a voice, without rest, and without a future. The brilliance of Athens was sustained by hands that would never be allowed to raise their own voices. This model of society wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate structure. Slavery in Greece was legal, normalized, and morally accepted. It wasn't just about prisoners of war or isolated punishments. It was a robust, well-managed system with laws, penalties, and even sales contracts. Slaves were registered as property, rented out, or inherited. And contrary to what many believe, it wasn't just the poor who owned slaves. Intellectuals, artists, and political leaders, all of them benefited from the labor that kept the city running. This abyss between the democratic ideal and the enslaving reality raises a disturbing question. How did the Greeks themselves justify such contradiction? For many of them, the enslaved person wasn't seen as fully human, but rather as a talking tool, as some ancient texts described. Slaves were viewed as part of a household's property, comparable to tools or domesticated animals. They weren't considered incomplete citizens. They were seen, by society's standards, as outside the pact of humanity. This dehumanization had a clear purpose: to preserve the balance of the polis. If freedom were granted to everyone, who would do the manual labor? Who would care for the children, clean the streets, dig the silver mines? The Greek answer was blunt. There had to be a class with no rights, so another could have time to philosophize, create, and debate. That was the logic behind the Greek miracle. Democracy, therefore, was a restricted access theater, a spectacle of enlightened ideas sustained by a dark and silent foundation. While philosophers discussed virtue and citizenship, few dared to speak out against slavery. It was easier to ignore those offstage. After all, they had no names, no votes, and no recorded memory. But what about those who lived in chains? Who were the people who upheld the glory of Greece while never appearing in statues or history books? Where did they come from? How did they live? Were they all foreigners captured in wars, or were some born into slavery and raised under the weight of servitude within Greece itself? They had no names in official records. They weren't counted in censuses. They had no right to speak, to choose, to love, or to dream. But without them, Greece would have had no temples, no trade, no glory. They were the invisible ones, the forgotten, the enslaved. Contrary to the simplistic idea that they were all prisoners of war, the truth was far more complex. and cruel. Greek slavery had multiple origins and justifications. Many enslaved people were foreigners captured in battles and invasions: Thracians, Scythians, Lydians, Egyptians, Ethiopians, Persians, and even other Greeks. Others were victims of piracy, kidnapped from distant regions and sold in port markets. And some were born into that condition, children of enslaved women, inheriting from birth the fate of living under someone else's command, like part of the household furniture. The mark of slavery began on the body. Many were tattooed, branded with hot irons, or forced to wear identification collars engraved with phrases like "runaway slave," "return if found." This labeling was a way to erase any trace of individuality. A person stopped being someone and became a function: cook, porter, prostitute, servant. Within the slavery structure, there was a cruel hierarchy. Some worked in their masters' homes, called domestics. They were closer to the family, but not exempt from violence or abuse. Others were sent to the agricultural fields, enduring grueling labor and severe physical punishments. Then there were those who worked in silver mines, like the ones in Laurion, true underground cemeteries where men and children died suffocating, crushed between rocks and dust, never seeing the sun again. And there were those sold for pleasure. Women and teenagers were turned into sex slaves, often from puberty. They were exploited in brothels or offered as private entertainment. Some were forced to live in households as concubines, with no legal protection or dignity. The enslaved female body was doubly violated, treated as merchandise and as a symbol of the master's power. Greek society classified the enslaved by utility. They were transferable, giftable, even rentable property. A master could lend a slave to someone else or make them work for outside pay, collecting the profits. Sales contracts included clauses like "no physical defects" or "skilled in a particular craft," as if they were work animals. But the most devastating aspect was the erasure of identity. Most enslaved individuals didn't have their names preserved in history. We know of their existence through fragments, legal texts, accounting records, laws, but almost never through their own stories. They were silenced not only in life, but also in memory, and yet some managed to leave traces behind. Archaeological findings reveal anonymous graves marked with signs of resistance, phrases etched into stone, hidden drawings, prayers in African or Asian languages, tiny cries of humanity fighting to survive oppression. It's important to remember that Greek slavery was not based on skin color. Unlike the racialized system that would emerge centuries later in modern slavery, the Greek criteria were more geographic and military than racial. A defeated and indebted Greek citizen could end up enslaved, even if he looked and spoke just like his captors. That made the system even more unpredictable and terrifying. To be enslaved in Greece was to have your life reduced to a function. You could be punished for showing intelligence, beaten for showing fatigue, ignored for showing pain. You worked to build cities you would never be allowed to enter as a citizen. You watched your sons be sold, your daughters violated, and your entire existence erased. And still, some resisted. Some tried to escape, knowing full well the punishments that awaited. Others disobeyed, sabotaged, etched secret messages into walls, sang songs from their homelands, taught their children their native languages in secret. Amid horror, a spark of human dignity endured, one that even the most brutal slavery couldn't fully extinguish. Slavery in Greece wasn't just a legal system, it was a habit, a way of thinking, of living, of organizing society. It was so deeply rooted in everyday life that it became invisible, like the air people breathe without noticing. The chains weren't only on the wrists of the enslaved, they were in the minds of free citizens, in customs, in theater, in laws, even in prayers. They were invisible, and that made them even more dangerous. In most Greek city-states, slavery was seen as a legitimate part of social organization. It wasn't viewed as an evil or a problem to be solved. It was simply a fact of life. From a young age, boys were taught that owning slaves was a sign of status. Families raised their sons to command, while the enslaved were trained to obey. This structure was replicated across all levels of society, from small farming villages to sophisticated urban centers. Greek laws didn't just allow slavery, they regulated it. There were rules for buying and selling, punishments for runaway slaves, permissions for physical abuse, and in some cities, even laws about mutilation in cases of insubordination. It was a complete legal system designed to protect owners and control the bodies of those who served. And the most shocking part? Almost no one spoke out against it. Silence was the norm. Language itself helped reinforce this structure. Words like douloi and oikates appeared in everyday records as if they referred to common household items. Popular expressions dehumanized the enslaved, likening them to animals, tools, or goods. And this language shaped how people saw the world. If a slave was just a talking thing, why feel compassion? In public spaces, enslaved people were invisible figures. They worked as porters, bakers, masons, cooks, musicians, attendants, and still they had no right to speak, to gather, or to make demands. They had no last name, no land, no right to justice, and no access to public office. When they made mistakes, the blame was collective. When they did something right, the credit always went to the master. Even religious festivals and civic rituals reinforced the social hierarchy. Some events required enslaved people to serve their masters joyfully, as part of the natural order of things. In other cases, a day of freedom for slaves was staged, only for everything to return to normal the next day. It was a symbolic way to reinforce who commanded and who obeyed. And slavery wasn't only present in daily life, it appeared in theater, philosophy, literature, and art. In tragedies, enslaved characters were usually secondary, caricatures, fools, or tragic figures with little emotional depth. In political discourse, they were treated as resources, not people. Few questioned the justice of the system, and when criticism did arise, it was quickly smothered by the dominant logic. Someone had to serve so that others could thrive. The most perverse aspect was how naturalized slavery became, creating a culture of numbness. Free citizens walked past chained and beaten slaves in the streets without flinching. Children grew up witnessing punishments without understanding the horror behind them. It was simply the way the world was. Questioning it was seen as foolishness, rebellion, or moral weakness. And the enslaved themselves, many after years of violence and humiliation, internalized this logic. Some accepted their place out of fear, others due to lack of options. Many had never known another kind of life. This made slavery persist not just through physical force, but through psychological domination. The worst kind of prison is the one that convinces the prisoner they were born to be there. The system was so sophisticated, it even allowed masters to appear generous when freeing a slave, even if that just meant trading chains for invisible shackles. The normalization of slavery was, above all, a triumph of ideology over empathy. A triumph that lasted for centuries and even tainted the very ideas we now call Western thought. But how did the greatest minds in philosophy accept all of this? How could thinkers who shaped ethics, logic, and politics justify slavery? The answer, for anyone expecting outrage or compassion, is unsettling. Most of them stayed silent, and when they did speak, they justified it. Socrates, the master of questions who wandered the streets of Athens challenging citizens to reflect on justice, lived surrounded by slaves. While his dialogues explored profound ideas about good and evil, not a single line condemned slavery. It's as if it didn't exist in his philosophy, or worse, as if it was too obvious to question. Plato, his most brilliant student, envisioned a perfect city in the Republic, a place of balance, order, and wisdom. But even in his utopia, slaves remained. His ideal society still needed invisible servants to function. Freedom, in that model, was a privilege reserved for the thinking elite. Everyone else was the base that supported the system. Aristotle, the most pragmatic of the three, went even further. In his treatise Politics, he claimed slavery was natural, that some people were born to obey, just as others were born to rule. He referred to slaves as living tools, comparable to instruments. To him, it was fair for inferiors to be dominated, since it benefited both parties, a cold, logical, and profoundly cruel way of thinking. These ideas didn't stay buried in antiquity. They traveled through the centuries and were later used to justify new forms of oppression. Colonial empires, modern slave systems, segregationist structures, all found support in the reasoning that some are born to serve. Philosophy, which should have been a beacon, became a crutch. But what about the enslaved? Did they have any real chance of gaining freedom? In a world where even the philosophers saw it as the natural property of the few, were there legitimate paths for a slave to become free? Yes, there were loopholes, rare, controlled, and dangerous. Enslaved people could sometimes gain freedom through manumission, an act where the master voluntarily granted their liberty. Some did so out of pity, others for political or financial reasons. In other cases, the enslaved could slowly save money and buy their own freedom. But this freedom came with conditions. The freed slave remained tied to their former owner. They owed them favors, respect, symbolic obedience. They couldn't access full political rights. They were tolerated but never fully accepted. If they rose too high, they became a threat. If they protested, they became dangerous. And they could even lose their freedom over any claim deemed valid by the system. The freed person was a showcase, proof that the system worked, but also a constant reminder of its limits. They carried a name that wasn't theirs, a story they couldn't tell, and a scar society would never let them forget. And for enslaved women, the situation was even darker. Being a woman in Greece already meant living under strict control. Being a woman and enslaved meant having both body and soul completely dominated. These women didn't just serve, they were possessed. Their roles ranged from the kitchen to the bed. They were used as concubines, wet nurses, state-run brothel prostitutes, and forced breeders. Their children were born nameless, rightless, and destined to feed the same machine that had destroyed their mothers. They weren't allowed to love. If they did, they were punished. If they got pregnant, they couldn't raise their children. If they resisted, they were sold, beaten, or killed. Their bodies belonged to the system, and their dignity was constantly violated, not just by their masters, but by an entire society that considered them inferior by both birth and gender. And still, in the shadows, these women found ways to survive. They formed bonds with each other, protected one another, taught forgotten songs and memories from distant lands. They stitched in silence, whispered hidden prayers, scratched markings on the kitchen and courtyard walls, silent screams. They resisted however they could. They loved in the ways they knew how, and they endured. All the while, Athens flourished, the city seen as the symbol of Western civilization, of rational thought, of freedom, grew upon a foundation of suffering. The Parthenon, the architectural pride of the world, was built with slave labor. The silver mines that funded democracy devoured human lives without mercy. The theaters that praised human tragedy gave no stage to those who truly suffered. Athens sparkled over buried bones. But while Athens masked its oppression with marble and noble words, Sparta did the opposite. It institutionalized terror. There, the Helots, an entire population enslaved through military conquest, lived under constant threat. Young Spartans were trained to kill Helots as a rite of passage. The state officially declared war on them every year, just to make sure their deaths wouldn't count as murder. It was a militarized system of total control. Humiliation was ritual, oppression was educational, fear was the law. And yet, the helots resisted. They organized uprisings, escapes, acts of sabotage. They planted fear in the heart of the most feared city in Greece. But the brutality with which they were crushed showed that in Sparta, control over the body also meant control over hope. And when Greece began to fall, the system didn't disappear, it just changed shape. Rome inherited the model. The Middle Ages remodeled it. Modern slavery perfected it. But the Greek DNA of servitude remained, the idea that the glory of a few justifies the pain of many. Ancient Greece gave us words like democracy, philosophy, ethics, and liberty, but it also left behind silences. Silences about the bodies that built its temples, silences about those who lived and died without names, silences that for centuries were treated as irrelevant because they were enslaved. In this video, we dove deep into the hidden layers of a civilization the world learned to admire, but never learned to question. We discovered that the same Athens that inspired the world was built with shackled hands, that the same Sparta that produced warriors ruled through terror, and that behind every lofty speech there was always someone being silenced. This isn't about erasing Greece, it's about fully illuminating it. About recognizing that every civilization has its light and its shadow, and that we only evolve as humanity when we dare to look at both. Today, maybe we don't wear visible chains, but many forms of servitude still exist: inequality, exclusion, social invisibility. That's why understanding the past is more than historical curiosity. It's a commitment to the present and the future. If this content made you think, share it. If it shifted your perspective, like it. And if you believe more people deserve to hear the truths history books often ignore, subscribe to this channel. Here we tell history with all its voices, even the ones the world tried to silence, because no civilization is truly great if it forgets those who held it up with their own blood.